If you came here for a super in-depth analytical look at Jojo Rabbit and how it lampoons World War II Nazism, it's not here. Instead, here's Blazing Saddles.
He rode a blazing saddle, he wore a shining star. His job to offer battle to bad men near and far.
A film all about lampooning Old West racism and white nationalism, following the escapades of one black sheriff, Bart. Now, why is this important to bring up? Well, in my decade of staring at the TV and watching the pretty pictures, my dad comes to me one day and asks if I've seen Blazing Saddles. After answering no, he put it on the TV and we watched it. And it's one of the greatest films ever.
Hey, you can't park that animal over there. It's illegal.
Now, what makes Blazing Saddles so great? Now, that's the tricky thing about the question. No one really has the correct answer.
It's a very sorry state of affairs when comedy genius Mel Brooks has to admit that his classic film Blazing Saddles could never be made today, and sadly he's right. Political correctness and the easily offended special snowflake crowd would simply lose their minds.
Are you sure about that?
Instead, I'm going to tell you, because I have 11 subscribers, which means that whatever I say is correct because no one will bother to watch and correct me. Huzzah! Blazing Saddles is an anti-hate movie. The story sets out to satirize the old US that was infamous for slavery and for normalizing bigotry towards anyone who wasn't a white dude. Literally every character in this movie that is white is portrayed as cartoonishly racist.
When you were slaves, you sang like birds. Come on, how about a good old work song?
It's a piece of commentary meant to satirize and critique old America for how overtly bigoted people were at the time. I mean, yeah, white governors definitely weren't hanging horses, or maybe weren't stupid enough to build railroad tracks over quicksand, but hey, it's the Old West, maybe they were. If you've ever had a conversation with someone about this film, it's likely you've heard something along the lines of, this movie will never get released nowadays, and like me, you'll probably walk away from that conversation completely bemused. That's because of one thing, nobody gets this movie. People seem to think that Blazing Saddles was made to challenge political correctness? Like the film was apparently made to see how quickly it'll get cancelled or something? And no, that's not what the movie's about. The film wasn't throwing around slurs and outlandish jokes, some of which haven't aged that well, just to be daring. Those jokes were made to emphasize how bigoted the Old West was. Now, what does this have to do with Jojo Rabbit? Because, people are doing that again.
You're a 10-year-old kid who likes dressing up in a funny uniform and wants to be part of a club.
Not true!
Jojo Rabbit, Taika Waititi's latest installment in his lineup of extremely underrated comedies, uses an anti-hate story to explore the insane bigotry of World War II anti-Semitic propagandized Nazi Germany, following the escapades of Jojo Betzler, a 10-year-old German boy who aspires to be a Nazi and to be Hitler's best friend, who is also his imaginary friend.
Of course you can.
He blindly follows the inane philosophy of World War II fascism, completely ignorant of the fact that World War II is nearly ending and Germany is losing. If you haven't seen the trailer, the main emotional conflict is about Jojo finding a Jewish girl named Elsa, living in refuge in his home, which leads into a cavalcade of life lessons that ultimately leads to him rethinking his blind allegiance to Nazism. In short, Jojo Rabbit is about maturing past your toxic and narrow-minded worldview, and how such toxicity can be normalized. Throughout the film, you'll hear plenty of insane fear-mongering tales about Jewish people from Nazi higher-ups, how they're this otherworldly demonic spawn who can mind-control others and seek after shiny objects. An exaggeration of what kind of anti-Semitic stereotypes were placed on Jewish people. It's played for laughs because these tall tales just continue to get more and more ridiculous, and it's never insensitive because specific slurs aren't ever used. There's a sense of tastefulness to it because you know where this type of humor is directed at, and it's never done at the expense of Jewish people being harmed on screen. How this plays out with Jojo is a tug-of-war story of progressiveness versus bigotry with him and his mother.
Someday you'll meet someone special.
Why does everyone keep telling me that?
Who else tells you that?
Everyone?
We learn later that it was his mother who offered refuge to Elsa because she and Jojo's father are actually against the Nazi reign. She clues this in very clearly at the beginning when she bluntly states that the war is pointless.
God damn it! Why does that make you happy? You hate your country that much?
I love my country. It's a war I hate. It's pointless and stupid, and the sooner we have peace, the better.
It's all a part of Jojo's character development, and the way the film visually contextualizes this growing maturity is Jojo's inability to tie his shoes. His mother is the one who always ties them. Meanwhile, his imaginary friend Hitler is the fathering force pushing back against his mother's radical nature. It's Jojo's way of denying the blunt truth right in front of him, his immaturity and wrongly ingrained bigotry fighting back the progressive teachings of his mother. Hitler starts out as a jovial, satirical representation of the Nazi Führer to mock him, but as the film goes on, he slowly becomes more stern and rather unfriendly too. It's at that point when Jojo realizes he was wrong. This is the one with spoilers. Towards the end of the film, Jojo sadly finds that his mother has been hanged. He breaks down and everything comes full circle. Nothing makes sense, and everything Jojo once believed in is falling apart around him. His town is invaded by American forces, and his town, in a desperate act of suicidal white nationalistic pride, defends their town to no avail. Jojo's Nazi scout friends suicide bomb their enemies, buildings are blown up, people are shot and killed, and Jojo just barely scrapes by. In the skirmish, Jojo's friend tells him that Hitler shot himself. The town is taken over and the war is over. It's a great sequence, and though unfortunately I can't show you the scene in this video, it's a great final stepping stone for the movie's narrative and Jojo's maturity. Jojo is saved by a former Nazi captain, who, in a brief state of humanity, saves him by pretending Jojo was a Jew, whilst they were briefly held prisoner by American troops. He rushes home, hesitantly tells Elsa that the war is over, fully rejects his imaginary friend Hitler by kicking him out the motherfucking window, and the movie ends on a bittersweet note. So what do these movies have in common? Well, aside from people forgetting how social commentary works, not that much. I've heard people describe Jojo Rabbit as Mel Brooksian, and in some form I can agree with that. If anything, I think this movie is a much easier watch than Blazing Saddles, because that movie is old, and it's more likely you'll emotionally connect with what's happening in Jojo Rabbit. Some of the jokes in Blazing Saddles probably won't sit well with you.
Watch me.
Or you'll be too young to really get the jokes.
You do it for Randolph Scott.
Blazing Saddles was a satirical declaration against racism, pointing out how inanely stupid and overtly romanticized old Western culture was just part of a bigger declaration of bigotry as a whole. Mel Brooks and his characters made fun of racism to delegitimize it. The black man's a sheriff now. Deal with it, the movie will say. But for some reason, people don't see it that way. It's plainly seen as a movie that said the N-word 50 times. It's Mel Brooks' most telling film, but isn't largely remembered for that. Granted, a lot of jokes didn't really age too well, and don't contribute to the anti-bigotry narrative the film was going for. Jojo Rabbit isn't like that. The big caveat with Blazing Saddles is that it is admittedly rather old, and the comedy-focused style of Mel Brooks' work leads to a film with admittedly stale, flat shots. To put it shortly, it looks outdated, and in some aspects, this also extends to the writing.
How'd you people try to get a little track lead, not to jump around like a bunch of Kansas City
And if you're not one to enjoy the aesthetic of old-ass comedies from the 80s, I doubt Blazing Saddles will be your cup of tea. And really, looking at it broadly, it is a bit crude during those moments when a racist just spouts the N-word here and there. Looking at it from a modern perspective, it feels more like shock value rather than a clever subversion of its intended use. And if you're sensitive to hearing that word, even in the understandable context this movie sets up, you'll likely never sit comfortably when watching this film. Jojo Rabbit, meanwhile, doesn't suffer from this. Despite this incredibly sensitive subject matter, there really isn't much in the way of offensive humor or culturally insensitive remarks. The movie had plenty of opportunities to use slurs or anti-Semitic language, but it largely doesn't. It's probably the most politically correct movies about Nazis I've ever watched. I don't know how to feel about that. The cinematography is a splendor. Pretty much every single shot in this film gives a warm and welcome tone that helps you settle into the comedic tone before hitting you hard with a good old retrospective satire. And honestly, in this day and age where we get some weirdos who think it's weird when a Wolfenstein Twitter says Nazis are bad, I think we all need a film like Jojo Rabbit. It's not all satire, mind you. The movie has a soul too. All the performances are great, especially from Roman Griffin Davis and Taika Waititi. There's a wonderful sense of pace between the comedic moments and the more down-to-earth humanizing moments, but done in a way that the film is never boring. Scenes rarely last too long, but they're also not too short to take away from the emotional beats of any scene. Going off topic a little, I think satire or comedy overall gets too much of a shallow attitude when it is done. You apparently can't have a serious movie with sprinkled in levity, and a film all about levity can't coexist with a serious story. That's not to downvote any story that prefers to stick with one tone, but stories like Jojo Rabbit is proof that comedy can still say something. This film is more than just making fun of Nazis. It's making fun of Nazis because their ideology should be mocked. Nazism is a dangerous ideology that invokes violence and hate crime to marginalized groups. Nazis weren't just bigoted about Jews. It's not enough that you were white, blonde, and have blue eyes. If you were gay, deformed, or arbitrarily considered anything other than part of what they called the Aryan race, you were considered subhuman. a type of bigotry that grew to dangerous lengths, to the point that these unfairly marginalized people were massacred and slaughtered. It's not enough to say that fascism is bad. After all, Nazis are still a thing in this day and age, and that's honestly incredibly scary. All of this isn't to say that Jojo Rabbit will completely or really aid in reducing the number of modern day Nazis. Really, we need to acknowledge that fascists are bad and wrong, and diminishing their ideology to its most blunt fundamentals and pointing out, in retrospect, how childish and closed-minded it all is worth doing. Before Klenzendorf saves Jojo and is shot down by American troops, he tells Jojo that he's a good man. The line, in essence, isn't made to reinforce Jojo as a good Nazi. Rather, it's Jojo being told that he isn't a Nazi. It's very much implied Klenzendorf was aware Jojo was harboring a Jewish girl, but refrained from outing him regardless. Jesus, look at all these red squiggles. The Nazi captain knows Jojo is young, and it isn't too late for him to change and escape from the fascist ideology he's been conditioned since birth into believing. We, as the viewer, support Jojo as a character regardless of his views because he's a kid, and his views are not absolute. We support him because we want him to grow past his faults, to grow past the lies and propaganda he's been fed for so long. It's made all the more believable through the movie's use of comedy. Ultimately, it's a story about a young kid learning to gain back his humanity. His mother and Elsa were emotional pivoting points for that maturity. Really, it isn't until he admits that he's in love with Elsa does he come to realize it. Hitler was looked up to as many people's idol, and Jojo Rabbit presents that idol as a doddering fool who got his ass kicked by a 10-year-old. Fuck off, Hitler, and Godspeed, Taika Waititi.
In a beautiful day, here I believe.
Thank you for watching the video. Kind of a mini update for the 11 people subbed to my channel. First off, thanks for making it this far into the video, and I hope you liked it. I know my voice is still gross and weird. I'm working on that. I have a backlog of videos I've been wanting to make. The next video I planned to make was on Sonic Generations. I'm not sure what I'll do after that. Also, I recently started editing for SNReloaded, a gaming channel who regularly streams on Twitch. I'll link their channel and Twitch in the description. This will help me exercise my editing chops in a sense, and I'm happy to have something to do when I'm not working on my videos, which is like never. Anywho, please subscribe if you like what you saw. I'm improving with each video, and I'd like the support to motivate me into making more of these rambly videos. Might make a Patreon, because I'll be fucked if my dumb trans ass can't get this channel monetized. My name is Ophelia, and I love you.